Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian David Price. David has authored a number of books, including Winning the 10 Crucial Days, The Keys to Victory in George Washington's legendary Winter Campaign, Rescuing the Revolution, John Haslett's World, and the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776. Now, since 2021, David has authored 10 scholarly articles for the prestigious, peer-reviewed Journal of the American Revolution, and is the recipient of the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution's Bronze Good Citizenship Medal and a Certificate of Appreciation in recognition of his work as an author, speaker, and historical interpreter at Washington Crossing Historic Park and Princeton Battlefield State Park. So, David, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be back with you. This is starting to become a habit.
Yeah, that's a good
but it's a good one.
It's a good one to have. So let's talk about the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776. First of all, how did you come to write this book?
Very circuitously, as it turns out. I wasn't planning to write a book about the Battle of Harlem Heights. I was planning to write a book about Thomas Knowlton, who, as you know, features very prominently in this book. So I started out working on a manuscript about Knowlton, and I got pretty far into it. As I recall, I was, knocking on the door of 40,000 words, I think. Well, I'll spare you the gory details, but that didn't pan out. And then this is one of those examples of, one door closing and another opening at the same time. So about the time that I realized that probably wasn't going to happen, a book about Thomas Knowlton, I was contacted by Bruce Franklin, who's the publisher at West Home, as you know, and which, of course, is one of the leading publishers, I would say, on Rev War titles. And he had read an article that I wrote for the Journal of the American Revolution, which, of course, West Home owns, about Thomas Knowlton. And he was looking for someone to write a book about the Battle of Harlem Heights for the Small Battle series that he launched in 2020, I guess it was. So this must have been, I guess it was mid to late 2021. And so, he asked me if I'd be interested. Now, my initial reaction to that idea was not really, because from what little I knew of Harlem Heights, it was sort of my, one of the, what I would call a Rodney Dangerfield battle. Made, well, large skirmish or small battle, depending on your point of view. And I didn't know that much about it, but I knew enough to have a sense that, it wasn't a, significant military engagement from the standpoint of, altering the dynamic of the New York campaign. And I guess what changed my mind was when I was, talking to him about this. I explained to him what I had been doing with Knowlton. And I thought, oh, well, maybe, and this would probably be my only chance to do it, because nobody, as far as I know, has written a modern day work about Thomas Knowlton. The only person I can think, he's mentioned a lot of primary and secondary sources, but as far as writing something on him per se, the only thing I could think of was the well, I guess we call it a monograph that was written back in 1861, I think, by Ashbel Woodward. And so I had put a lot of research and time into, working on a manuscript about Knowlton, and I thought, well, maybe I can use, Harlem Heights as a vehicle for enhancing his historical profile. And I explained to Bruce that, if I were to write this book, that's how I would want to do it. And he was okay with the idea. He encouraged me to do that. I worked up an outline and ran it by him and by the two series co-editors, who are distinguished historians in their own right, as you know, Mark Edward Lender and James Kirk Martin. And they were all on board with this. So I was able to, as you can imagine, I was able to use a lot of what I had already done um, in terms of what was going to be the Knowlton manuscript to plug that into, the Battle of Harlem Heights manuscript to the point where I have a chapter in there. It's a short book, as are all the books in this small battle series, but 4 chapters, and one of the chapters is entitled "The Rise of Thomas Knowlton,"
Mhm.
which is a pre-Rev War biographic piece on him. Um, so that's really how it came to be.
Mhm. That's interesting. Well, before writing this particular book about the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776, you produced a trilogy about the 10 Crucial Days campaign in the winter of 1776-77. How was working on this particular book different from those first 3 books of yours on the 10 Crucial Days?
Yeah, the actually when I was claiming to have written a 10 Crucial Days trilogy at the time because I was counting John Hazlitt's World, my
Hmm.
third book, as part of that.
Right.
In truth, it's not really a book about the 10 Crucial Days per se, although certainly it figures prominently in the story, given what happened to, Hazlitt and his Delaware Regiment. But, my first 2 books, The Rescuing the Revolution and The Road to Assunption Creek, were clearly about the TCD. Um, the new book I have coming up, Winning the 10 Crucial Days, can make a legitimate claim to being, part of the
Hmm.
third volume in the trilogy. Um, so I did feel a little like a fish out of water, I guess, when I, start working on a book about the Battle of Harlem Heights. Um, Even though it's time-wise, it's not that far from the 10 Crucial Days. Of course, it was part of the New York campaign that set the stage for the New Jersey campaign that eventuated in the 10 Crucial Days. Um, Continental Army's winter offensive of 1776-77. That's the stuff of legends, if you will. So I guess so it was different because I hadn't in terms of writing something for publication, um, I hadn't really delved into the New York campaign. I knew something about it, of course, but I had a general idea what had happened at Harlem Heights. But it certainly opened my eyes, I think, in terms of um, understanding or giving me a sense that what happened in Harlem Heights was more significant than I had previously thought. And, which I realized pretty quickly, I think, once I got into the research for this book. And also, I think, in terms of looking at the New York campaign overall, what happened before and after Harlem
Hmm.
Heights, it gave me more of a sense of, uh, well, really how lucky I think Washington and his army were to escape what could have easily been a complete disaster. It was a near disaster, shall we say, in terms of what happened, and uh, giving me a sense of the um, fortuitous developments, I guess, that occurred, and the calculations that were made on both sides of this
Hmm.
conflict by Washington and by the British commander, General William Howe, and and the way that played out. Um, so, I appreciated the opportunity to learn
Hmm.
more about that.
Hmm. Well, before we dig into the Harlem Heights issue itself, I did want to mention something. You mentioned you talked to Bruce Franklin in his West Home Publishing. I'm delighted that he started a small battle series because, in my opinion, there's just so many battles that are completely unknown, but yet they were significant. And the series of targeting on those battles, I think, is pretty important. What are your thoughts about that? What do you think is the significance and the need for the small battle series?
Yeah, well, it actually, let me preface my answer by saying my book, in comparison with the other volumes that have come out,
Right.
um, the my book is maybe an anomaly in the sense that these engagements typically did not, unlike Harlem Heights, involve, well, they didn't necessarily involve a significant number, if any, Continental Army troops, regular Army
Hmm.
troops, and normally were not such that Washington would have been there. He was there at Harlem Heights, but if you look at the other, the other battles in the series, and just looking at, the front of my book, um, the initial one was the Battle of Connecticut Farms in Springfield by Ed Langle. That came out in early 2020. Then Upper Sandusky, Musgrove's Mill,
Right.
down in your neck of the woods, Gloucester, and there's another, at least one or two others that have come up more recently. Um, and so um, I think the premise behind this is that reading about these battles, these small
Hmm.
battles, quote unquote, gives the reader a much richer, a much deeper sense of what the military conflict was really like,
Hmm.
both for the participants and for the communities that were impacted, and gives the one a realization, um, or recognition that one needs to have in order to really appreciate what was going on here during this conflict, that most of the military engagements that were fought, and Lord knows how many there were, um, especially in the South, were
Hmm.
not major battles. I mean, the major battles were the exception. And
Right.
however you want to define major battle, but the names that we're familiar
Yeah.
with. And so, Harlem Heights, I suppose, comes as close to being a quote unquote major battle. I wouldn't call it that, but as any of the battles in this series. So um, it gives one a more granular understanding of what was happening. That's the
Hmm.
theory behind doing this series.
Hmm.
And uh, I think that's why they felt, Bruce and Mark um, and Jim felt, it
Yeah.
was worth pursuing this series. So
Sure.
I don't know how many people are buying the books, but I think those that do,
Right. Yeah.
will have a much, as I said, a much more, um, you know, complex, if you will, nuanced understanding of what was occurring during this conflict.
Yeah, it gives us a little bit broader perspective for those of us who want to dig a little deeper in the side battles and the skirmishes and that type of thing that are not largely known. And you certainly won't find many of them in the history books, if at all, that
Right,
type of thing. So, well, let's
right.
specifically talk about Harlem Heights and the Battle of Harlem Heights. What do you think is the most significant thing, or what is the significance of that battle?
Um, Two things I think really. I mean, first, it's was the first open field victory by Washington's troops
Hmm.
in a military engagement, by U.S. Army troops, if you will, in a military engagement, um, against the British and Hessians. The other thing is the um, experience it provided for Washington's troops. And now, I should amend my answer to say that, in addition to it being the first um, open field victory for Washington's troops, it was the first occasion on which you had American soldiers from different geographic regions fighting in a successful action. So most of the soldiers that were involved were from New England, meaning Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. But you also had soldiers, regulars and militia from Maryland and from Virginia. And so this was the, harbinger, if you will, I think, of the gradual emergence, formation of a national army that became the primary instrument for securing American independence.
Hmm.
Um, so that's the 30,000-foot view of the battle. But closer to the ground, I think what was significant was the very valuable experience it gave,
Hmm.
Washington soldiers, the ones that, participated in the fighting, probably about 2,000 or close to 2,000 of his troops. And that was a relatively small, excuse me, portion of the total troops he had under his command at the time. Um, maybe 20% or so. But they were learning how to be soldiers, quite
Hmm.
literally. And of course they had their what's whooped at Long Island
Hmm.
less than a month before. And then the day before this battle, when the British invaded Manhattan Island, the Americans basically fled without a fight. Um, and In fact, I remember when when we were creating the maps, or Bruce was creating the maps for the book, and one of the maps was about what happened on September 15th, the day before Harlem Heights, when
Hmm.
the British and Hessians landed on Manhattan Island, and the title at the top was, I think it said, the Battle of Kip's Bay, and I said there really wasn't any battle. The
Right.
Americans fled.
Yeah.
They were afraid of their own shadows, let alone that of the enemy. Um, but this was obviously a confidence booster for them, but it was valuable experience standing up to uh, enemy troops who they had to be fair about it or accurate about it. They had the enemy outnumbered, but these were elite
Hmm.
troops that they
Right.
were fighting. And if they weren't elite, then those British regulars would not have been able to, stand up to the numerically superior American force as long as they did that day.
Hmm. Well, what's different about this book from other accounts of the battle?
Um, it's newer.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's
Fair,
shorter,
fair enough.
probably
Fair
short,
enough.
maybe shorter. I don't know. Well, it, relies on, I hope, I would say, current as well as, traditional scholarship. I think that, and I'm writing obviously from a, 21st century perspective as
Right.
opposed to earlier accounts. The classic work on this subject, I think to this day, is the book by Henry P. Johnston that was written in 1897, which I certainly you know found extremely helpful, and other 20th century authors obviously have. The As I alluded to earlier, the most significant thing about this that differentiates it from other books about Harlem Heights or other books, period, is the attention that it gives to, one of my favorite and I think sadly unrecognized um, unsung American military heroes, and a remarkable individual, I think, and that's Thomas Knowlton. So, and you know, I suppose more than anything else, to be honest with you, my my interest in writing the book, as you could infer from what I said, was as much or more about enhancing the salience of Knowlton
Yeah.
historiographically than Harlem Heights.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about him. You spent a significant amount of time talking about Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton. What role did he play, and what was significant about his involvement?
Um,
Why is he so
well, he
special?
was, yeah, he was, as far as Harlem Heights goes, his unit, the Knowlton's Rangers, which were uh, had been formed by Knowlton at Washington's request to serve as an intel and recon unit, the first intelligence unit in the United States Army in U.S. military history. And he's recognized as the father of American military intelligence today. I think it's fair to say. Um, they brought on this battle by Harlem Heights
Mhm.
by this um, reconnaissance mission that they undertook on the morning of September 16th, 1776, per Washington's orders. And so they were singularly involved to that extent. What they did brought on the fighting. But as far as Knowlton's overall role, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read a brief excerpt from the book, which I think really does him justice in a you know as abbreviated a manner as one can do. So the guy who wrote this says it better than I could. Now I was trying to make the case, this is in the last chapter, that Knowlton deserved to be, and I think deserves to be, recognized as being of the stature of, for comparative purposes, people like other Rev War heroes, if you will, like Joseph Warren, who was the leader of the Revolution of Massachusetts, and of course was killed at Bunker Hill or Breeds Hill, and General Richard Montgomery, who was one of the leaders of the invasion of Canada in 1775 and was killed in leading the attack on Quebec City on New Year's Day, 1776. They have gotten a lot more recognition then and, ever since than Knowlton has. But I think he deserves to be ranked up there, at that level, in my opinion. So I wrote, after saying that, consider Knowlton's record in the emergent struggle. He led the first armed contingent from outside Massachusetts into that colony to join the militia there in the wake of the opening shots at Lexington and Concord. He devised a novel rail fence that successfully resisted assault at the Battle of Bunker Hill and orchestrated a stubborn defense of his sector against the British attack, which prevented the Americans from being outflanked and enabled Knowlton's men to provide protective cover for the retreat from the rebel redoubt on Breeds Hill. He spearheaded a daring raid against the enemy at Charlestown, outside of Boston, that largely achieved its objective while barely firing a shot and without losing a single soldier. He organized an elite intelligence and reconnaissance unit at Washington's direction that has earned Knowlton recognition, as I said, as the father of American military intelligence, and which included the young Captain Nathan Hale, whom posterity crowned with the laurels of legendary heroism. And finally, he created the opportunity for and helped lead a successful counterattack at Harlem Heights that repelled the British in open field combat for the first time and boosted the faltering confidence of Washington's army. Now, I capped that off for the full effect. I capped that off with a source note at the end. This is literally the last source note in the book. And well, I was really worked up about this. Well, let me just read it without giving any further explanation. One can be forgiven for questioning why the Connecticut General Assembly, remember both Knowlton and Nathan Hale were from Connecticut, for questioning why the Connecticut General Assembly designated Hale as the state's sole official hero in 1985, and thereby consigned his superior officer to relative obscurity. Notwithstanding Hale's unquestioned bravery and commitment to the Revolution, what he accomplished in its service pales beside Knowlton's record. A dispassionate consideration of the respective contributions to these two martyrs to the patriot cause can yield only one conclusion. There is simply and emphatically no comparison between them. Replacing one man with the other as the official state hero at this point would presumably be problematic for some, but at the very least, Colonel Knowlton deserves equal billing with Captain Hale. Why not have a pair of state heroes? As they were connected in life, so let them be for eternity, at least in Connecticut. Partisans of Israel Putnam clearly have a case to make for their man, but the argument for Knowlton and Hale rests on their having made the ultimate sacrifice for the cause in which all three were engaged. Now I'll step down off my soapbox. So that's why he was special and why he's worth writing about, and I think deserves to be more widely recognized in the Rev War community.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that, certainly. If you look at the modern day, thought about when you talk about special rangers, special forces, that type of thing, generally the Army looks to Robert Rogers, of course, being America's first Green Beret or strike force. But of course, that was during the French and Indian War and at the outset of the American Revolution when Rogers was forming the Queen's Rangers initially. for the British. But you never hear about the first American equivalent to the Green Beret, you might say, of the French and Indian War, Rogers Rangers, and yet Knowlton held his own, and he performed a valuable function for the American Army as it was first forming. So, granted, it's nice to be able to acknowledge Rogers Rangers as perhaps the beginning of British North American ranging activities in the formal unit of the Army. But when it comes to the American Army, really, it kind of dissipates. You don't hear too much about Rangers that were formed in that capacity to fight for the American Continental Army.
Yeah, and in fact, that's where Knowlton got his training, if you will. He was a
Right.
ranger during the French and Indian War. He joined
Hmm.
up when he was all of 16, I think.
Yeah.
Um, Served for 5 years, received 3 promotions, and yeah, so that gave him a obviously, a distinctive set of skills and
Mm.
perspective on
Right.
18th century warfare. And the U.S. Army's or U.S. Army intelligence branch, if you will, um, their um, logo has the 1776 on it,
Right.
which is in reference to Knowlton's Rangers. And about 20 years ago, 95, I guess this was, the Military Intelligence Corps Association, which comprises the U.S. Army's intelligence components, created the Knowlton Award, and which is designed to recognize um, Corps members who have exhibited particular,
Hmm.
competence and character in their role. So, to that extent, he has received,
Yeah.
some recognition for what he did.
Sure. Sure. Well, besides Knowlton, are there any other unsung heroes, that are probably unknown to most people who figured prominently in this story?
Uh, the one who comes most readily to mind would be another officer who, like Knowlton, was mortally wounded at Harlem Heights, and that was Major Andrew Leach.
Hmm.
Um, from your neck of the woods, from Virginia. He was from
Yeah.
the Fredericksburg area, and he knew Washington. He had been to Mount Vernon before the war, and in fact, I think Washington knew other soldiers who were serving with Leach because they were from that area.
Hmm.
Um, and so Major Leach, was part of the attempted flanking maneuver that was led by Knowlton at the Battle of Harlem Heights. While the main American force was engaging the British, uh, Knowlton, at Washington's direction, led a force of about 230 men who comprised his Rangers, who were men from New England. Um, and Leach, Major Andrew Leach, was the second in command. He was, let's see, Knowlton at this point was 35, Leach was 28. Leach was commanding 3 companies from Colonel George Whedon's 3rd Virginia Continental Regiment. And so, well, as it turned out, their flanking maneuver didn't succeed, in the sense that they were not able to get, for whatever reason, they weren't able to get behind the British lines during the fighting. They wound up attacking the British on their right flank. And both Leach and Knowlton were hit by British musket fire in short order, and both died shortly thereafter, the same day, I think, and were both
Hmm.
buried together. So, and Leach, well, like Knowlton, had left behind a family, wife, and children
Hmm.
when he went off to serve. And he was recognized. I mean, if you read comments by Washington and others after the battle, both Knowlton and Leach were specifically named as, worthy uh, officers, which they were. And they were 2 of the 4 officers who died, American officers who
Hmm.
died in that battle. And if there's an argument to be made, I guess, for Washington not having fought the battle, certainly the death of such um, capable young,
Hmm.
officers who, certainly in Knowlton's case, I think it's indisputable that he would have been promoted to general had he lived long
Hmm.
enough to do
Hmm.
that, and probably in short order too. Um, that their loss was a heavy blow. Um, and I guess you could make the argument, well, this victory didn't change the course of the New York campaign, and then
Right.
Washington lost these officers, really good people. And so if there's an argument to be made for his having not fought the battle, I think that probably would be it.
So it's really maybe a symbolic victory for the Americans.
Um, yeah, I mean, it provided a temporary morale boost.
Right.
I say temporary because, it was part of I mean, it occurred in the midst of this series of otherwise unrelenting military setbacks for Washington's army. Um, but, it showed that the enemy was not invincible. And I
Hmm.
think so it created
Hmm.
this underlying um, sense among, Washington and his officers and, the common soldiers, at least the ones that had directly participated in the fighting, that under the right circumstances, and again, they, I think, pretty heavily outnumbered the British in this battle, they could in fact stand up to the enemy and
Hmm.
and and make them run,
Sure.
which they did on September 16th.
Sure. Well, let's talk about General Howe, the British commander. He decided to land his forces at Kips Bay on September 15th, 1776, was really today the site of 34th Street today in New York City,
Right.
instead of further north on Manhattan Island, so he might be able to trap Washington's army by cutting off a possible escape, from the island to the mainland. Why? Why did he do that? What was his strategy behind Kips Bay as opposed to maneuvering behind Washington?
Um, the path of least resistance.
Okay.
So Washington assumed that I think it's fair to say that Howe was going to land, or at least make his major landing, his priority landing, primary landing at Horn's Hook, further up the island on the east side, and so he put his best troops there, um, including Knowlton's Rangers, and it was heavily fortified. And the waters around there, if the British, aside from all that, if the British had tried to land there, the swirling waters in that immediate area would have been provided
Hmm.
much more of
Right.
a challenge, much more of a hazard, if you will, than landing further down at Kips Bay. And so, I think that's the reason that Howe chose to do it. He just figured that it would be, being the cautious fellow that he was, and also and always wanting to pursue the least risky maneuver, I think it's fair to say, for his troops. Um, I think it's not surprising that he chose to do that.
Hmm.
And where they landed, now he wouldn't. I don't know if whether he had a sense of this or not, but where they landed, it was not heavily defended. Most of the American troops there were militia, and after once the British launched their massive cannonade, from their ships and batteries on the other shore, uh, on the east shore of the East River. The I think even before the British troops actually landed, those militia had hightailed it out of there, or were in the process
Hmm.
of doing so.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, there's a legend that's grown up in the New York City campaign that Mrs. Mary Murray was occupying basically the time of General Howe and his officers, entertaining them at her home while the American troops were in the city. But her activities kind of allowed basically the Americans to escape while Howe's troops and the British Army were actually landing. Is there any truth to that legend that she actually detained Howe and his officers from actually engaging sooner in the battle?
You want the short answer or the long answer? The, the short answer is no.
Okay, all right.
Um, Yeah, she served them Madeira and cake. So, and
Okay.
if you believe that was intentional, that she was deliberately trying to stall the British, then that takes the cake. Um,
Right.
s- you know what? Say whatever whatever else you want about William Howe. He wasn't a dope,
Right.
and it's not likely that he would have allowed, a very amiable hostess, which Mrs. Murray was. She and her husband had a reputation for being such in New York society, such as it existed at the time, um, that he would have allowed her to outwit to outwit him. Um, I think how I believe probably sensed that at this point that the American troops that were in New York City, when the
Right.
British landed, about a quarter of Washington's army was still in New York City. The army had been in the process of evacuating the city for several days and moving up the island to Harlem Heights, where they had a strong defense, could establish a strong defensive
Right.
position on these bluffs that in some cases were 60 feet high, that stretched across the island from west to east. Uh, when the British and Hessians landed on September 16th, a quarter of those troops were still there under General Israel Putnam,
Mm.
and um, and a substantial portion of the American artillery, and other supplies. So Putnam led the evacuation out of the city, leading his troops up along the Bloomingdale Road on the west side of the island, as far away from the enemy landing as they could be, and still be on Manhattan Island. And but they didn't get up to a point opposite Kips Bay where the British landed for several hours.
Hmm.
Um, so they were further behind what I think it's fair to say, excuse me, behind in terms of the schedule than what Howe would have assumed. Um, Now, what you can fault Howe for in retrospect, but again, this was the way William Howe operated. He was nothing if not, cautious. Um, the British came ashore in two waves that day, about 4,000 men in the morning, and then 9,000 in the afternoon. The first wave, when they landed, they were kind of hanging out in a meadow just beyond where they had landed. And they essentially didn't do anything until the second wave landed because Howe had ordered them to stay put until his entire force was on the ground there,
Hmm.
um, assuming apparently that they were going to encounter a lot more resistance than they did. They encountered very little, as I've suggested. So, um, had that first wave been allowed to, proceed with vigor, shall we say, across the island from east to west, they could very easily have cut off the
Hmm.
evacuation of Putnam's force, and Washington would have lost a quarter of his army. As it was, the army lost more than half of its artillery because it was still in New York City.
Hmm.
So, but Mrs. Murray and her daughters were just, they were doing their thing. They were being, sociable when the British commander showed up. I don't think they had any ulterior motive, and I don't think it really that particular incident factored to what happened.
Hmm. Well, I guess also New York City was largely loyalist at the time as well. Of course, that eventually became more of a reality when the British decided to keep their base of operations there, after
Hmm.
these major battles. But speaking of landing, how would you compare what happened when Howe's army landed, when the army invaded Manhattan Island? How would you compare that to the British victory on Long Island that preceded it, in terms of the strategic significance of those two events?
Um, well, when the at the Battle of Long Island, um, which obviously was a major tactical victory
Right. Yeah.
for Howe's army, he was facing about half of Washington's force. The other half was still on Manhattan Island. Washington, as a making the mistakes of a novice commander, had divided his force that was,
Yeah.
an inferior force, a smaller force than what he was facing. The enemy had divided them in half, which was a mistake. But and as it turned out, fortunately for Washington, they were able, after that near disaster at Long Island, on the Battle of Long Island, they were able to escape, 2 nights later, to evacuate across the East River, thanks to um, well, natural elements. I mean, the
Right.
wind that kept the British fleet from
Right.
proceeding up the East River, and then a thick fog that set in the early morning hours and obscured their movement. When Howe landed on Manhattan Island 3 weeks later, um, roughly, uh, 18 days, I think it was, or something like that. Anyway, after Washington's evacuation, Washington's entire army was on Manhattan Island.
Mhm.
Now, so at this point, I mean, they were spread out, as I said, they had a quarter of their force in New York City,
Mhm.
which was going to make its way up to join the rest of the army on Harlem Heights. At that point, Washington had about, I think, maybe 10,000 troops on Harlem Heights, and he had another 6,000 further north at Kings Bridge, which was the northern
Right.
tip of Manhattan Island. And they were essentially guarding that um, escape route, if you will, because that was the only way off the island by land route. Um, so Howe had a chance to bag the entire American army, Washington's entire army, on Manhattan Island, which he didn't have a chance to do on Long Island. So strategically, I would say the fact that he was unable or unwilling to do that, um, had greater, strategic consequences
Mhm.
than
Yeah.
what happened at Long Island.
Mhm. Well, when you were doing research in this book, is there anything particularly that surprised you about it in your research? You find something that you were really surprised and unique that you hadn't expected?
Um, I don't, I don't know to what extent I was surprised at this. I don't remember exactly what my precisely what my level of knowledge was before I started getting into this, but it certainly um, drove home this point to me more vividly, I think, than I had appreciated before, and that was the the decisions that were made by both Washington and Howe after the Battle of Long Island, or non-decisions as the case may be. I guess not to decide is to decide, um, where essentially there was a stalemate there in terms of the movement of the two armies, for about a month after the Harlem Heights battle.
Mm.
Washington's army was, where was in northern Manhattan, between Harlem Heights and the Kingsbridge, and the northernmost British lines were just below um, Harlem Heights, and Howe did not move against Washington, did not attempt to outflank the Americans. Of course, the British Navy controlled, all the waters around Manhattan Island. Um, so the only way for the Americans to escape was via the King's Bridge. And I'm not sure, still not clear to me, I suppose I should research this more, what Washington was waiting for. I'm sure he
Mhm.
was getting advice from people, from some of his own officers to do something, to move, but he
Yeah.
stayed in position until I think it was on October 14th that they began to evacuate. At which point the British had finally gotten around to trying to launch a flanking maneuver by landing troops
Mhm.
on the Westchester coast. They tried it first at um, Throg's Neck, which was not a good place to land, and they were unsuccessful. And then uh, a few days later, they found a more suitable landing site at Pell's Point. But by that time, Washington's army was in the process of retreating north. It crossed over Kings Bridges and was on their way, well, ultimately to Harlem,
Yeah.
to White Plains,
Yeah.
where they would fight the battle there on October 28th. So I don't know what Washington was thinking during that time. He can thank his lucky stars that he was against, Howe, who was, um, as I said, nothing if not cautious. Now, what was Howe thinking? Um, My guess would be that, well, two things. The two things were going on there. That, one was his, as I say, his innate caution, which was motivated by a desire to, um, not put his army at any greater risk than he absolutely had to. Now, maybe that was, part of that may have been the post Bunker Hill traumatic syndrome because of what he had seen
Hmm.
on June 17, 75, when every officer on his staff was shot down, and somehow he miraculously escaped. Um, the other thing I think may have been a political motivation, if you look at how he conducted operations up until after the American victory over the Hessians in the first Battle of Trenton. At that point, he decided to say, no more Mr. Nice Guy. Now I'm going for the jugular. But up until then, um, it didn't seem like, it didn't seem like he wanted to trap the American army. In other words, he wanted to give them a whipping and then let them escape, um, presumably, because he was looking to achieve an outcome that would be, militarily successful for him, for his side, but that would conduce to, as much as possible, to at least a relatively
Hmm.
harmonious restoration of relations between,
Hmm.
the king's subjects and his, and Great Britain. And so he wasn't looking to destroy or cripple the American army. He just thought, if I beat them, um, which obviously he did Long Island, um, and then, they came ashore on Manhattan Island, and he was trying to create this sense among the rebels that they couldn't possibly resist,
Hmm.
Great Britain's armed might, and naval might, and hopefully they would become so despondent, those American soldiers and the civilian population that was sympathetic to the revolution, that they would, come to a realization that they could not possibly win this war, and they should, look
Yeah.
look to, look to achieve the best possible peace terms they could, um, with Howe. And of course, William Howe was there with his brother, Admiral Richard Lord Howe, as peace commissioners
Hmm.
who had been authorized by the British government to accept. They didn't really have the authority to negotiate any terms, but with the colonists, but to, accept their surrender and then promise them. I guess the best they could promise them was, if you end this foolishness and come back into the um, you know His Majesty's good graces, then he will listen to your grievances and hear you out. And
Right.
that was the best they could offer. So I'm guessing that's what he was thinking, and that's why he didn't move more aggressively in a
Yeah.
military sense. Because purely from a military standpoint, he was committing malpractice, I
Right.
think.
Right.
Uh, and I think that was
Yeah.
the best chance. If Britain had a really golden opportunity to end the war, if you assume, and maybe this assumption isn't correct, that the capture of Washington's army, excuse me, would have ended the war. If that's true, then I think Britain's best chance to win the war, to end the war,
Yeah.
would have been for how to trap Washington's army on Manhattan Island.
Sure. Sure. Well, as a final question, what's the one thing that readers should take away from this book? What should they remember, if nothing else? What's the thing that they should take away from the Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776?
Two things. Thomas Knowlton.
Okay.
Uh, well, that's I want, as I said, purpose of writing the book was as much to promote Knowlton as the Battle of Harlem Heights. But to appreciate what some of the things I was talking about, that it was the first was the first victory by American troops in an open field battle, and if for that reason alone, deserves more recognition than it's received, and and I guess also appreciate the I guess the interplay of factors that influence the outcome of military campaigns such as this, some of which we've talked about, where luck, dumb luck is, or contingency, as I said elsewhere, can factor in very heavily, as much or more than deliberate or intentional tactics by by generals on either side of the conflict. And that was no less true in this campaign and this battle than others. And in the spirit of this small battle series of which the book is a part, I know I've said more than one thing, obviously, but just appreciate that that these smaller conflicts really, in terms of the totality of what was going on, if you really want a sense of what was going on during the 8 years of this war of attrition, you don't, obviously you don't necessarily have to read all these books, but you do have to have, I think, a general understanding of the role that these small engagements played, because they did factor in. And as you well know, especially, you're particularly interested in the Southern campaign, and everybody wants to talk about Yorktown, but I think what Nathaniel Greene and the militia were doing in the Carolinas was absolutely as important, if not more important, to the eventual outcome of the campaign. So
couldn't
throughout
agree
the
more.
war,
I couldn't agree more.
that was a huge factor.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, thanks so much for joining me again today. Really appreciate it. I'm glad to see you again, and hope to do it again some other time.
Okay, great. Thank you.
To our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with historian David Price, author of The Battle of Harlem Heights, 1776, an outstanding analysis about an important yet largely unknown battle of the American Revolution, available where books are sold. My name is Randy Flood. Thank you again. Join us next time for another exciting interview with an outstanding historian on the real American Revolution. So long for now.